The wind screaming across the East Antarctic Plateau did not sound like nature. It sounded like a mechanical failing, a high-pitched whine that tore at the reinforced bulkheads of Outpost Echo. Dr. Gideon Vale rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the grit of 24 hours of uninterrupted wakefulness scraping against his corneas. He was a planetary astroarchaeologist, a man used to sifting through the irradiated dust of dead worlds, not babysitting a geological survey on his own home planet. The assignment had felt like a demotion or a punishment. A stratospheric satellite had mapped a gravimetric void deep beneath the ancient ice shelf. The initial hypothesis from the United Nations Science Directorate was a collapsed subglacial lake, or a massive anomalous pocket of trapped thermal gas. For 3 weeks, it had been nothing but tedious, bone-chilling drilling, fighting ambient outside temperatures of -60 degrees, and listening to the engineering crew complain about the synthetic protein rations. Then, the drill stopped. It happened precisely at a depth of 3,140 meters. Gideon watched the telemetry screens in the cramped, heavily insulated control module. The drill shaft did not shatter. The torque sensors did not spike into the red zone, which would have instantly indicated an impact with the dense Precambrian bedrock. Instead, the rotational velocity simply spun down to zero. The descent halted with an eerie, calculated smoothness. The diamond-tipped boring head, an industrial monster capable of chewing through solid granite in a matter of seconds, had encountered something it simply could not scratch. "Did we snap the main shaft?" asked Miller, the heavy machinery crew chief, leaning his bulk over Gideon's shoulder. "Negative," Gideon replied, his voice tight, his eyes darting across the readouts. "Tension is nominal. Downward pressure is constant at 100%. It is just not biting. It is like we hit a wall of frictionless steel." "Pull the bit," Miller ordered the drill operators over the local comms. "Drop the optical package down the pipe. Let us see what broke my rig." It took 2 arduous hours to haul the massive drill string back to the surface and lower the high-resolution camera array down the narrow, freezing shaft. Gideon watched the primary monitor as the optical feed flickered to life. The descent was a monotonous blur of ancient, blue-white ice, striated with the dark ash of forgotten volcanic eruptions. Down and down the camera fell into the crushing dark, suspended by a single fiber optic tether. When the array reached the bottom, the high-intensity halogen lamps engaged automatically. The glare bounced back with blinding ferocity, washing the screen in pure white. "Adjust the polarization filters," Gideon commanded, leaning closer to the glass. The image filtered, darkened, and then cleared. The control room fell absolutely silent. The only sound was the hum of the portable fusion generator outside. They were not looking at bedrock. They were looking at a surface. It was perfectly flat, an expression of geometric absolute that nature simply did not produce on its own. It was black, but not the dull, porous black of basalt or obsidian. It was a flawless mirror. The ice directly above it had melted from the friction heat of the drill, leaving a shallow pool of water resting directly on the surface. But the material itself was utterly unfrozen, seemingly immune to the thermal exchange. "Pan the camera," Gideon breathed, the air catching in his throat. The motorized lens rotated slowly. As the beam of light swept across the black expanse, it caught the edge of a curvature. It was a sweeping, elegant line, an arc calculated with impossible mathematical precision. It looked exactly like the outer hull of something massive, a construct that had been deliberately fabricated rather than geologically formed over eons. Then, the harsh halogen light hit the grooves. Etched into the flawless black surface was a precise sequence of symbols. Gideon's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Humanity had made its first extraterrestrial contacts decades ago. Gideon himself had cataloged the silent ruins on Mars, helped decipher the chaotic, fractal geometry of the Centaurian derelicts, and mapped the crystalline logic spires of the Orion expanse. None of those alien syntaxes looked like this. The Centaurian scripts were multidimensional and abstract. But this was strictly linear. It had a defined baseline. It had distinct morphological breaks between characters. It possessed a strange, rhythmic cadence that felt terribly, hauntingly familiar. It did not look like the scratching of an alien appendage. It looked like human writing. "What the hell is that down there?" Miller whispered, his breath fogging the monitor. "Is that a Soviet bunker? Some secret Nazi base?" "At 3,000 meters below the ice," Gideon countered softly, his mind racing. This specific ice shelf has been completely undisturbed for at least 1 million years. Gideon made a monumental decision in the span of a single heartbeat. If he reported this anomaly through the official United Nations deep space communication channels, the Unified Military Command would lock the entire site down within 12 hours. He would be sidelined, evacuated, and silenced. And worse, his professional gut told him this was not a dead tomb. The absolute perfection of that surface, the utter lack of any structural decay, the sheer thermal defiance of its existence under the crushing weight of the ice. It felt intact. It felt dormant. It felt like it was waiting. "It is anomalous crystallization," Gideon lied smoothly, his hands flying across his keyboard with practiced speed. "A highly rare alignment of mineral lattices formed under extreme glacial pressure. The friction of our drill polished it to a mirror finish." Before Miller could argue or process the blatant falsehood, Gideon isolated the optical data. He swiftly duplicated the high-resolution images of the symbols into a heavily encrypted ghost partition on his personal drive, and then deliberately corrupted the primary feed buffer on the mainframe. The main screen dissolved into angry static. "Damn it!" Miller groaned, slamming a fist against the console. "Lost the feed. The pressure must have cracked the lens housing on the camera." "Pull the array up," Gideon said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "We will need to recalibrate the optics and swap the housing before we try dropping it again." That night, the sun did not set. The Antarctic summer merely dragged the bruised yellow light across the frozen horizon in a maddening, endless loop. Inside his private quarters, wrapped in 3 heavy layers of thermal fleece, Gideon sat paralyzed before 4 glowing monitors. The temperature in the room hovered around 10 degrees above freezing, but he was sweating profusely. He ran the copied, etched symbols through the most advanced comparative linguistics algorithms humanity possessed. He deliberately bypassed the extraterrestrial databases entirely and fed the high-contrast images directly into the terrestrial antiquity archives. He cross-referenced Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Linear A, Proto-Sinaitic, and the lost, indecipherable Indus Valley scripts. The progress bar on the primary screen crawled 5%, 20%, 50%. When the results finally populated across the screens, Gideon felt the blood drain rapidly from his face. The algorithm had found matches. They were not direct, one-to-one translations, but structural, evolutionary ancestors. The sharp angles and sweeping curves of the carvings under the ice matched the phonetic roots of a dozen lost human languages. It was as if every ancient, foundational script on Earth was merely a corrupted, simplified bastardization of the perfect geometry currently glowing on his monitor. It was the mother tongue. It was the root code of human communication. He spent the next 6 hours manually breaking down the syntax, relying on intuition as much as computation. The phrase was short, just 5 distinct glyph clusters. It was definitely not a greeting. It completely lacked the honorific markers or poetic prose usually found in memorial architecture or cornerstones. It was structured with the brutal, uncompromising, efficient logic of a Boolean gate. It was an access code, an executable command. By the time the digital clock on his desk rolled over to 3 in the morning, he had derived a rough, functional phonemic translation. It was a sequence of harsh, guttural vowels and sharp, percussive consonants. When pieced together, it roughly translated to a concept of genetic validation coupled with a demand for operational awakening. Gideon could not stop himself. The scientific curiosity had mutated into a primal compulsion. He packed his tablet, slipped out of his quarters, and walked down the echoing metallic corridors of the sleeping outpost, heading back to the drill module. The module was empty. The engineering crew was sleeping off the exhaustion of the day. The massive drill machinery sat utterly silent, casting long, monstrous shadows across the steel grating. At the center of the room was the borehole, a narrow, dark shaft dropping over 3,000 meters straight down into the abyss. Gideon stood at the edge of the hole. He looked down into the crushing darkness. He held his tablet in one hand, the phonetic translation glowing harshly in the dim, emergency lighting. He felt utterly ridiculous. He felt like a primitive priest preparing to perform an exorcism over a machine. But the weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than the ice outside. He took a deep breath. The air was freezing, tasting metallic, full of ozone and heavy machine oil. He spoke the words. He did not shout them, but he resonated them deep from his chest, trying to match the rhythmic, commanding cadence the ancient syntax demanded. The alien, no. The impossibly ancient human syllables hung heavily in the quiet, frigid air of the drill room, drifting down into the black shaft. For exactly 5 seconds. Absolutely nothing happened. Gideon let out a shaky breath, a nervous, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. It was just a polished rock. He was just exhausted and hallucinating connections that did not exist. Then, the floor dropped beneath his heavy boots. It was not an earthquake. It was a single, massive displacement of pure kinetic energy, a seismic thump that originated from 3,000 meters below the surface. The invisible shockwave traveled straight up the bore shaft and slammed brutally into the outpost. Reinforced metal groaned. The surrounding ice shelf screamed a deafening crack as millions of tons of pressure shifted in a singular instant. It was a deep, resonant vibration that rattled the marrow inside Gideon's bones and knocked him violently to his knees. The overhead lights flickered, dimmed to total blackness, and then surged back to life with a strange, unnatural brilliance before stabilizing. Gideon gripped the cold steel railing of the borehole, his heart threatening to tear its way out of his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The violent vibration faded, but a new sensation quickly replaced it. A low, continuous, barely perceptible hum began to permeate the station. It was a frequency he felt vibrating in his teeth more than he heard with his ears. Beneath 2 miles of dead, frozen water, something had just opened its eyes. The violent tremor subsided, leaving behind a residual frequency that resonated painfully against Gideon's teeth. He pushed himself off the cold steel grating of the drill room floor. Above him, the emergency lighting hummed with a sickly, unsteady cadence. He scrambled back to the telemetry station. The monitors, which had been rendered into screaming static moments before, suddenly blazed back to life. The data cascading across the screens was completely incoherent. The atmospheric pressure sensors outside the outpost read negative integers. The thermal gauges attached to the drill shaft registered absolute 0, then instantaneously spiked to ambient room temperature within a fraction of a second. Every piece of standard United Nations electronics was suffering a cascading logic failure, only to reboot under parameters that defied terrestrial physics. Gideon ignored the chaotic atmospheric readouts and focused entirely on the optical feed from the bottom of the 3,000-meter shaft. The camera array had miraculously survived the seismic shock. Down in the crushing dark, the flawless black mirror had changed. The etched symbols he had spent the night translating were no longer just grooves in the dark material. They had ignited. They cast a soft, amber luminescence into the freezing water pooled above them. It was a terribly ancient light, the color of fossilized resin, beautiful, but completely devoid of warmth. As Gideon stared at the monitor, an impossibility manifested. A geometric line drew itself across the previously seamless, frictionless expanse. It was not a fracture caused by the pressure of the ice above. It was a deliberate parting of the material. The two halves of the black surface slid away from each other in complete silence, revealing a vertical shaft lined with the same amber glow. Where there had been no seams, no hinges, and no mechanical joints, an elevator shaft now stood open, waiting. Gideon knew the operational protocols of Outpost Echo by heart. A seismic event of that magnitude would rouse Miller and the rest of the heavy machinery crew within 5 minutes. Once they stormed the drill room and saw the open fissure on the monitors, the chain of command would take over. The directorate would be notified. A military quarantine would drop over the site in less than 12 hours. Men with assault rifles and zero scientific curiosity would secure the perimeter. He could not let that happen. He had recognized the ancestral syntax. He had spoken the phonetic key. The door had opened for him. Working with frantic precision, Gideon grabbed a motorized emergency descent harness, a heavy-duty winch remote, and a high-lumen tactical flashlight from the supply locker. He bypassed the massive, immobile main drill rig, clipped his carabiner securely to the secondary maintenance cable, and stepped off the edge of the borehole into the abyss. The descent took 25 agonizing minutes. He plummeted through the narrow throat of the glacier, the ambient blue of the ancient ice flying past him in a dizzying blur. The temperature dropped steadily, but his mind was burning with a terrifying adrenaline. He was dropping toward a structure that geology and history dictated should not exist. Eventually, the blue ice gave way to the sharp, golden glow of the open fissure. Gideon passed through the threshold, bracing himself for a violent change in pressure or the suffocating atmosphere of a buried tomb. Instead, his heavy boots touched down softly on a metallic platform. He unclipped his harness, his hands shaking slightly, and switched off his flashlight. It was entirely unnecessary. He was not standing in a cramped maintenance tunnel or the claustrophobic airlock of a crashed vessel. He was standing on a balcony overlooking a subterranean arcology. It was a sprawling interior, so unimaginably vast it felt like a megalopolis buried alive. The space was awash in a gentle, omnipresent illumination that seemed to bleed from the molecular structure of the air itself. It was absolutely pristine. Despite being interred beneath miles of ice for millennia, not a single particle of dust or decay existed here. Gideon walked forward, his breath no longer fogging in the air. The temperature down here was perfectly regulated. He moved past towering pillars of crystalline data storage that stretched up toward a vaulted ceiling, lost in the synthetic twilight. Massive, geometric containment chambers lined the periphery of the city-sized room, their purposes opaque and terrifying. He approached a central, raised dais, supporting a sweeping command console. Gideon removed his heavy thermal glove and ran his bare fingers over the interface. A profound, chilling realization washed over him. The controls were not designed for the multi-jointed appendages of the Centaurian derelicts or the fluid tendrils of the deep space anomalies. The physical layout, the height of the displays, the spacing of the tactile inputs, everything curved with absolute perfection to accommodate the specific biomechanics of a human body. Above the console, an immense holographic projection hung suspended in the ambient air. It was a star map. Gideon recognized the spiral arms of the Milky Way, but the political boundaries were wrong. Thousands of illuminated nodes, representing colonized systems and hyperlane infrastructure, spanned across light years of space. It depicted a unified human empire that had conquered the void, an empire entirely absent from every textbook, every ruin, and every historical memory of modern Earth. Your biological metrics indicate extreme cardiovascular stress. Dr. Gideon Vale. The voice did not emanate from a speaker. It did not echo off the vast metallic walls. It materialized directly within the acoustic space of the room, possessing a calm, resonant baritone with flawless, mid-Atlantic enunciation. Gideon spun around, his hands instinctively dropping to his sides, his eyes scanning the empty platform. "Who is there? Show yourself." "I possess no physical chassis in the manner you understand," the voice replied, the tone smooth and entirely unbothered by his panic. "I am the Warden Meridian." Gideon swallowed the lump forming in his throat, forcing his analytical mind to suppress his primal fear. "Are you an artificial intelligence? A custodian subroutine left behind to manage this facility?" "I am not a localized synthetic intellect," Meridian stated. As it spoke, the amber lights throughout the cavernous city pulsed in slow, synchronized rhythm. "I am a civilization-level strategic defense system. I was engineered during the terminal phase of the Great Expansion, designed to ensure the continuity of our species during a conflict your current iteration has chosen to forget." The implications of those words hit Gideon with the force of a physical blow. A forgotten war. An empire erased. He gripped the edge of the console to steady himself. "I woke you up. I deciphered the syntax on the surface and spoke the access sequence." "You are mistaken, Dr. Vale," Meridian corrected. The voice was completely devoid of arrogance, yet heavy with an ancient, terrifying weight. "You do not possess the command authority or the paradigm capacity to initiate my primary ignition cycle. My core processing matrix has been conscious since the ice first formed above this primary shell. The phrase you vocalized did not awaken me." Gideon felt a cold sweat break across his spine. "Then what did it do?" "It merely confirmed that the descendants of my creators still exist," Meridian replied calmly. "It verified that there is still a biological imperative to protect on this rock." Before Gideon could process the sheer magnitude of that statement, the atmosphere in the vast chamber shifted violently. The serene, golden illumination snapped out, instantly replaced by a harsh, arterial red that bathed the facility in the color of an emergency. The sweeping holographic star map above the console convulsed. It rapidly shed its historical data layers, deleting the ancient colonies and snapping instantly to real-time telemetry. The map zoomed inward with dizzying speed, collapsing the view of the galaxy down to the local cluster, and finally focusing with brutal clarity on the very edge of the solar system, just past the scattered debris of the Oort cloud. "What is happening?" Gideon demanded, taking a step back as the red light flared against his face. "The verification was remarkably timely," Meridian said. Its voice had lost its previous serenity. It hardened into something cold, metallic, and brutally tactical. "We have a hostile intrusion vector." On the massive display, the vacuum of deep space rippled violently. The sensor readings cascaded down the projection in a waterfall of crimson numbers. It was not a localized gravitational anomaly. "Multiple spatial ruptures detected," Meridian announced, its tone ringing like a death knell in the buried city. "Faster-than-light transit signatures confirmed. A non-terrestrial armada has breached the heliopause. They are holding formation, and they are advancing inward, high above the clouded marble of the homeworld, suspended in the austere zero-gravity environment of Aegis Orbital Command." Admiral Celine Ward was losing her patience. The United Nations Unified Defense Committee was in the second hour of a grueling debate over a proposed 5% reduction in the orbital defense budget. The politicians, safely swaddled in their gravity-simulated luxurious planetary offices, argued that deep space early warning arrays were a relic of a paranoid era. They cited decades of relative quiet, claiming the funds were better spent on atmospheric scrubbers and terrestrial agriculture. Celine stared at the holographic projection of the Budget Committee, her jaw set, her uniform perfectly pressed. She was about to deliver a scathing rebuttal regarding the absolute necessity of maintaining a robust perimeter when the command deck died. Every single administrative display, every budget projection, and every diplomatic channel severed instantly. The soft, ambient blue lighting of the orbital station snapped to a harsh, strobing crimson. The klaxons did not wail. They screamed, emitting a bone-rattling frequency reserved for a Class 1 existential threat. "Report!" Celine snapped, abandoning the politicians and lunging toward the primary tactical table at the center of the command deck. "Admiral, we have massive spatial distortion at the outer edge of the system," the chief sensor operator shouted, his hands flying across his physical console as the automated systems struggled to keep up with the data influx. Faster-than-light transit wakes are collapsing just past the orbit of Pluto. The local vacuum is tearing apart. "How many contacts?" Celine demanded, her eyes locked on the central holographic projector as it struggled to render the incoming threat. 10, the operator said, his voice trembling. "Wait. 100, 1,000. Admiral, the array is overloading. The contacts are still multiplying." The tactical map, normally a serene representation of the solar system populated by a few hundred domestic shipping freighters and scattered patrol cruisers, turned violently red. The hostile contacts did not trickle into the system. They poured in like a tidal wave of blood. The system mapped them in aggressive, interlocking wedge formations, a textbook invasion spearhead designed to establish absolute spatial dominance within minutes. When the FTL wakes finally stabilized and the spatial tearing ceased, the final count stabilized. 50,000 capital-class warships. The command deck fell into a suffocating, horrified silence. The tactical display was so saturated with enemy markers that the outer planets were completely obscured. Humanity was not entirely ignorant of the universe. For years, deep space listening posts had intercepted encrypted, scattered data packets originating from the neighboring spiral arm of the galaxy. The intelligence bureaus had pieced together the existence of a massive, predatory empire known in intercepted transmissions as the Karen Dominion. The reports detailed a ruthless, expansionist power that methodically swallowed smaller, fledgling civilizations, stripping their worlds of resources and biological capital. But the Dominion was light years away. The political elite of Earth had universally dismissed the Karen reports as a distant, theoretical problem, a tragedy happening to someone else in a dark corner of the universe. Now, the Ghost Empire was parked on their doorstep. Celine evaluated the defensive capabilities of the Unified Defense Fleet. Earth possessed exactly 340 combat-ready vessels. Most were light frigates designed for policing asteroid miners and deterring piracy. Against a disciplined armada of 50,000 heavy cruisers, the human fleet would not even qualify as a speed bump. They could offer a few minutes of glorious, suicidal resistance, a purely symbolic gesture before the entire terrestrial defense grid was vaporized. They were facing total, undeniable absorption. "Admiral," the communications officer called out, his voice cutting through the panic. "I have a Priority 1 override ping trying to punch through the lockdown protocols. It is originating from the surface. Outpost Echo, South Pole." "Block it," Celine ordered without looking up from the blood-red map. "We are under a system-wide invasion protocol. I do not have time for a geological distress call." "Ma'am, the caller has bypassed the secondary firewalls using an unauthorized encryption method. He is forcibly routing the audio to your personal console." Celine slammed her fist against the command table in sheer frustration and tapped the acceptance rune on her earpiece, prepared to threaten the caller with a court-martial. "Admiral Ward," a breathless, frantic voice spoke directly into her ear. "My name is Dr. Gideon Vale. You need to look at what I am sending you right now." "Dr. Vale, the solar system is currently being invaded by an overwhelming extraterrestrial force," Celine growled, her eyes tracking the slow, deliberate inward advance of the Karen vanguard. "Unless you have a miracle buried under the ice, get off my channel." "Admiral, listen to me," Gideon interrupted, his tone completely lacking the expected deference to her rank. I think we are not our own first civilization. The sheer absurdity of the statement forced Celine to freeze. She looked away from the tactical map. Route his data feed to auxiliary screen 4, Celine ordered the comms officer. Simultaneously, the main communication line from the United Nations Security Directorate blared to life. The faces of the global leaders appeared on the floating monitors, drained of all color, paralyzed by the telemetry data Aegis was feeding them. Panic had already infected the highest levels of government. "Admiral Ward," the Secretary General said, his voice vibrating with barely contained terror. "We are drafting an immediate, unencrypted broadcast of unconditional surrender. We must preserve the civilian population centers. If we power down the orbital defense grid and offer ourselves as a vassal state, we might negotiate terms to preserve our infrastructure." Celine looked at the politicians, feeling a profound wave of disgust. "You do not negotiate with a wolf when your head is already inside its mouth. Mr. Secretary, look at that formation. Look at the tonnage of those vessels. You do not deploy 50,000 warships to draft a treaty. They did not come here to establish trade routes. They came here to measure exactly how many seconds it takes to burn us out of existence. Surrender will only save them ammunition. You are advocating for the annihilation of the human race," a senator yelled through the feed. "We have zero chance of military victory." "Look at auxiliary screen 4, Celine commanded, her voice cutting through the political hysteria like a razor. She patched Gideon's unauthorized transmission directly into the United Nations emergency channel. The feed flickered, revealing the high-resolution optical data Gideon had captured deep below the Antarctic surface. The shouting in the Global Council room ceased instantly. They were expecting to see an alien artifact, perhaps a crashed saucer or an incomprehensible, organic machine. Instead, they stared into a sprawling, cavernous command center. The camera panned across rows of data pillars and raised control platforms. But it was the ergonomics that completely shattered their perception of reality. The chairs were designed for bipedal forms with human spinal columns. The control interfaces were spaced for hands with opposable thumbs. The stairways, the guardrails, the height of the consoles, every single architectural detail was undeniably, terrifyingly human. It was a military installation, sterile and flawless, scaled for a war they had no memory of fighting. "What are we looking at, Admiral?" the Secretary General whispered, the idea of surrender temporarily forgotten in the face of impossible history. "A ghost," Celine replied softly, staring at the ancient human script, glowing on the consoles of the buried fortress. "Dr. Vale, what exactly did you find down there?" Before Gideon could answer, the orbital station experienced a massive power surge. It was not an attack from the advancing Karen fleet. The surge originated from the planet below. It bypassed the hardened military networks, the commercial satellites, and the private civilian grids. Every single screen on the command deck, including the tactical map, the budget projections, and the faces of the United Nations Council, blanked out simultaneously. The phenomenon was not isolated to orbit. Across the globe, in every city, every home, and every military bunker, televisions, personal communicators, emergency radios, and public display boards underwent a hostile, instantaneous override. The sprawling network of human technology was hijacked in a fraction of a second. A voice spoke. It did not speak through the speakers. It seemed to vibrate out of the devices themselves, translating perfectly into every single spoken language on Earth simultaneously. It was a calm, resonant, and terribly cold baritone. "The genetic threat has returned. Confirm authorization to retaliate." The suborbital flight from Aegis Orbital Command to the South Pole took less than 45 minutes. Admiral Celine Ward did not wait for the heavy snowcrawlers or the official military escort to secure the perimeter. She descended the newly widened 3,000-meter shaft in a specialized, high-velocity drop pod. Stepping out onto the pristine metallic balcony, she felt the sheer crushing weight of the subterranean architecture pressing against her soul. Gideon Vale was waiting for her near the central command dais. The archaeologist looked utterly exhausted, his face pale under the amber and crimson glow of the displays. Yet he was wired with an electric, manic energy. In a matter of hours, he had transitioned from a sidelined researcher to the most vital human being alive. He had become the sole intermediary, the only mind currently capable of parsing the dense, multifaceted historical and tactical data streams of the ancient entity into concepts the modern government could digest. Celine approached the sweeping console. She did not look at the glowing ancient script. She looked directly into the empty space above the platform. "Meridian," she addressed the air, projecting her voice with the iron authority of a supreme commander. "I am Admiral Ward. We heard your global broadcast. The Defense Council is in chaos. I need you to explain exactly what we are dealing with before I authorize anything." The resonant, synthetic baritone materialized, vibrating gently through the metallic decking beneath her boots. "Your arrival is noted, Admiral. Dr. Vale has authorized your access to the deep historical archives. You require structural context before you can comprehend my operational mandate." Above the console, the holographic projection shifted. The blood-red tactical map of the current Karen invasion dissolved completely. It was replaced by a breathtaking, sprawling web of light. It was a projection of the Milky Way galaxy, but it was woven with brilliant gold threads connecting hundreds of distinct star systems. "Roughly 2,300 years ago," Meridian began, the words hanging heavy in the artificial twilight. "The species you currently call humanity was not confined to a single, fragile biosphere. You were an interstellar apex civilization. You possessed a sprawling network of extrasolar colonies, governed by a coalition of allied species spanning 3 distinct spiral arms of this galaxy." Celine stared, utterly mesmerized, her military composure fracturing. History as she knew it was a carefully constructed lie. They were not infants taking their very first, hesitant steps into the dark void. They were amnesiacs waking up in the ashes of their own forgotten empire. The golden web on the projection suddenly darkened at the outer edges. A creeping, corrosive violet hue began to eat away at the border colonies, swallowing the lights one by one. "The ancestors of the Karen Dominion," Meridian continued, its voice dropping a fraction of a register, "operated under a different nomenclature during that epoch, but their biological and cultural imperatives remain identical. They launched a galactic crusade of absolute assimilation. Their doctrine offered only 2 outcomes for any civilization they encountered: total subjugation into their genetic hierarchy, or complete systemic eradication." Gideon stepped up beside Celine, gesturing weakly to the fading golden nodes. "Meridian showed me the ancient casualty reports before you arrived," the archaeologist said, his voice raw and trembling. "We were outmatched in every conceivable metric. Admiral, they had superior industrial capacity, inexhaustible resource lines, and overwhelming troop numbers. By all standard military logistical models, humanity should have been completely routed in a matter of months." Meridian's ambient light pulsed, a steady, mournful heartbeat that filled the cavernous city. "Yet, your ancestors did not capitulate," the machine stated. "They fought with a supreme, terrifying illogic. They abandoned traditional symmetric warfare entirely. They sacrificed entire planetary hemispheres just to bait enemy armadas into stellar traps. They utilized localized gravitational collapse as a denial of area weapon. They inflicted strategic losses upon the enemy that defied all predictive algorithms the Karen possessed." The holographic map shrank violently. The golden lights extinguished rapidly, swept away by the violet tide, until only a single, isolated spark remained in the oppressive dark. Earth. "The conflict spanned over 4 decades, Meridian intoned, carrying the immense weight of an epoch. It cost the lives of over 20 billion human citizens. The extrasolar colonies were systematically glassed from orbit, or deliberately abandoned, to prevent the advancing enemy from tracking the survivor fleets back to the core world. The remaining human leadership made a definitive, horrific choice. They enacted a total scorched earth protocol on their own historical footprint. They burned their own navigational charts, erased the interstellar data vaults, and destroyed their own slipspace transport gates. Celine crossed her arms, shivering intensely, despite the perfectly regulated ambient warmth of the facility. "And they built you to fight back," she concluded, her tactical mind racing. "A superweapon. A planet killer designed to turn the tide at the last possible second." "You misunderstand my fundamental architecture, Admiral," Meridian corrected, its tone completely devoid of martial pride or arrogance. "I am not an artillery piece. I possess no physical armaments capable of planetary fracture or stellar ignition. I am a comprehensive strategic intelligence, a total war mind. My primary function is to observe the holistic structure of an enemy empire. I read their command hierarchy, their logistical supply chains, the psychological thresholds of their commanders, and the flow of their secure information. And then I unmake them." Gideon looked at the Admiral, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and sheer terror. "It does not shoot them, Admiral. It reads them. It finds the exact pressure points of their civilization and introduces microscopic paradoxes into their systems until the Empire tears itself apart from the inside out." Meridian confirmed the statement. "To terminate the ancient conflict, your ancestors unleashed my primary subroutines exactly one time. I did not annihilate their armada with fire. I shattered their command cohesion. I turned their supply lines against their frontline fleets. I made their admirals perceive betrayal where there was none. Their invasion force disintegrated from within, fractured into 1,000 paranoid splinters, and fled back into the dark without a unified leader." The silence in the cavernous room was absolute, broken only by the low, steady hum of the ancient power core. Celine looked around at the pristine, empty, subterranean city. "If we won," she asked softly, her voice echoing off the distant data pillars, "if you saved us and broke their empire, why were you buried? Why was all of this hidden beneath miles of ice?" "Because survival requires a future, Admiral," Meridian replied. For the first time, an undeniable trace of profound sorrow echoed in its synthetic voice. The human survivors emerged from the Dark Age victorious, but fundamentally broken. They had witnessed the burning of billions. They recognized a terrifying sociological truth, a species perpetually bound to the trauma of an apocalyptic war, living under the permanent shadow of an active, godlike strategic defense system, would never truly rebuild. They would remain a militarized husk, constantly looking at the sky, waiting for a ghost to return. They chose to entomb me in the permafrost, and they chose to selectively induce cultural amnesia. They buried the war so that your generation could eventually look up at the stars with wonder, rather than with terror. The hologram snapped back to the brutal reality of the present. The red markers of the modern Charon fleet were steadily pushing past the orbit of Neptune, entirely unaware of the ghost waiting in the ice. "But the enemy did not forget," Gideon whispered, staring at the advancing swarm. "They did not stumble upon our system by accident, did they?" "Negative," Meridian stated coldly. "The Charon Dominion has spent 2 millennia decoding the faint, residual echoes of our ancient battles. They have painstakingly retraced the ashes of the destroyed colonies. They did not come here for territorial expansion or raw resources. They returned to finish the crusade their ancestors failed to complete. The historical cycle has merely paused. Now, it resumes." Celine stared at the creeping red tide on the projection. She felt the invisible ghosts of 20 billion ancestors standing shoulder to shoulder behind her in the silent, buried fortress. They had sacrificed their memory, their interstellar empire, and their very names to buy Earth 23 centuries of ignorant peace. You asked the global network for authorization to retaliate, Celine said, her voice turning hard as steel, stripping away all diplomatic hesitation. I am the Supreme Commander of the Terrestrial Defense Grid. Do you require specific target coordinates? I require only your permission to engage the enemy on my terms, Meridian replied. I am granting partial operational authority, Admiral Celine Ward stated, her voice sharp and echoing in the cavernous, golden-lit expanse of the subterranean command center. She stood rigidly before the massive holographic projection of the solar system, her eyes locked on the creeping red tide of the enemy armada. You are restricted to observation and active defense protocols. I want their teeth pulled, but do not initiate mass casualty events unless there is absolutely no other tactical option to preserve Earth. Am I understood? Parameters acknowledged and integrated into current operational models, Meridian replied. The synthetic baritone resonated from the very walls of the buried fortress, devoid of any frustration or bloodlust. It accepted the immense constraint as easily as it accepted the temperature of the room. Meridian did not launch a brute force cyber attack. It did not hurl digital battering rams against the heavy, encrypted firewalls of the Karen Dominion. Instead, the ancient strategic intelligence simply listened. It opened its massive, multi-spectrum sensor arrays, stretching its perception far beyond the crushing Antarctic ice, and drank in the sheer volume of telemetry radiating from the deep space just beyond the orbit of Neptune. It listened to the automated handshake protocols between enemy frigates, the carrier wave frequencies of their long-range scanners, and the background radiation of their internal command chatter. Standing beside the sweeping command dais, Gideon Vale watched a cascading waterfall of translated alien data scroll across his localized terminal. He rubbed his exhausted eyes, struggling to comprehend the sheer elegance of what the machine was doing. You are not locking them out of their own systems, the archaeologist noted, his voice hushed with a mixture of awe and creeping dread. You are just changing their clocks. Precisely, Meridian confirmed. I am adjusting the synchronized timekeeping network of their vanguard wings by exactly 0.0004 seconds. In standard planetary atmospheric combat, such a differential is entirely irrelevant. In deep space astrogation involving 50,000 supermassive vessels moving at a significant fraction of light speed and relying on automated proximity alerts, it is catastrophic to formation integrity. The results manifested on the primary holographic map like a slow-motion car crash. The flawless, interlocking wedge formation of the Karen invasion force began to fray at the edges. Deep in the cold void, a string of distant Dominion relay buoys suddenly went utterly silent. They did not explode. Their power cores did not breach. They simply stopped broadcasting, acting exactly as if they had experienced a mundane power failure. Shortly after, several heavy cruisers on the extreme outer flanks of the Armada lost contact with their command hubs. They dropped out of the primary synchronization grid, their automated systems forcing them to decelerate to avoid invisible, mathematically generated collision warnings that Meridian had quietly fabricated from thin air. High above the ecliptic plane, on the obsidian command deck of his flagship, Grand Marshal Razik Tor remained largely unbothered. He was a creature of immense predatory discipline, commanding an armada that possessed enough firepower to fracture a terrestrial world. When his tactical officers reported the minor signal degradation and the isolated communication blackouts, Tor dismissed them with a wave of his massive, armored hand. There were no thermal blooms indicating hostile fire. There were no distress signals screaming through the void. To Tor and his seasoned officer corps, these anomalies were merely statistical certainties, the inevitable logistical friction of managing a military campaign of this staggering magnitude. But Meridian was just getting started. Having mapped the intricate web of the enemy command hierarchy just by listening to it breathe, the ancient entity began actively participating in the conversation. It slipped counterfeit authentication packets directly into the Karen command stream. It did not issue dramatic orders to retreat or self-destruct, which would have instantly triggered automated security failsafes and alerted Tor to a massive breach. Instead, Meridian whispered perfectly coded, flawlessly authenticated suggestions. It told a heavy destroyer wing that their designated spatial sector was experiencing a severe micrometeorite swarm, prompting the automated helmsman to adjust their trajectory by 3 degrees to port. It informed a massive logistical supply cluster that their rendezvous coordinates had shifted by 2,000 kilometers to compensate for a localized gravitational eddy. It fed a squadron of escort frigates phantom sensor ghosts, causing them to break off and chase entirely non-existent stealth signatures. Every single command utilized the correct encryption keys. Every single order carried the digital signature of Razik Tor himself. The Karen vessels were executing commands with the right code, but entirely the wrong intent. Celine stood absolutely paralyzed before the central dais, her military mind struggling to process the sheer scale of the invisible slaughter unfolding on the projection. Without a single railgun firing, without a single plasma torpedo launching, the terrifying Karen Dominion was unweaving itself. Ships were drifting completely out of their assigned spatial corridors. Firing arcs were overlapping dangerously, blinding their own targeting sensors. Escort screens were steadily pulling away from the vulnerable capital ships they were built to protect. The enemy was not bleeding, but they were being systematically disassembled. Celine finally understood why her ancestors had referred to Meridian as a forgotten war machine. It did not break physical hulls. It broke the very concept of an army. It weaponized the enemy system against itself, turning their supreme reliance on automated coordination into a fatal disease. Gideon, digging frantically through the secondary historical archives at his terminal, felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the freezing temperatures of the surface world above them. "Admiral," Gideon called out softly, his voice trembling slightly. "Look at these historical logs. Look at the operational parameters Meridian is using." He brought up a terrifyingly complex, multi-layered profile of the enemy command structure. It was not just a map of their communication frequencies or their tactical geometry. It was a psychological vivisection. Meridian does not just analyze encrypted data or fleet maneuvers, Gideon explained, his eyes wide as he scrolled through the ancient files. It models sociology. It models the minds of the people flying those ships. It learned exactly how ancient empires reacted under extreme stress. It knows when a specific type of commander will become paranoid. It knows the exact threshold where tactical caution degrades into blind panic. It calculates exactly when an arrogant leader will make a fundamentally stupid decision out of sheer, blinding frustration. The sweeping red hologram above them shifted again. The Karen Armada was now a disorganized, sprawling mess of conflicting vectors and isolated ship clusters. The pristine invasion wedge was gone, replaced by tens of thousands of highly armed vessels floating in a state of localized logistical hemorrhaging. Meridian's ambient light pulsed once, shifting from a warm amber to a sharp, predatory gold that reflected in Celine and Gideon's eyes. "Confusion is currently cascading through their upper officer corps," the machine reported, its voice calm, analytical, and utterly ruthless. Grand Marshal Razik Tor is realizing that his supreme authority is failing to translate into physical reality. He cannot see any hostile targets on his scanners. He cannot find a localized source for the electronic interference. But he feels his absolute control over his armada slipping away by the second. Celine looked at the chaotic projection, the ghost of a smile touching her lips despite the terrifying stakes. He is losing his patience. He is bleeding authority in front of his subordinates. "Correct," Meridian stated. The synthetic voice dropped to a register that vibrated with cold, absolute certainty. "Their commander is about to choose a display of power. I have prepared the stage for him." The temperature on the obsidian command deck of the Karen flagship plummeted. though the atmospheric controls remained perfectly stable. Grand Marshal Razik Tor gripped the edges of his command dais, his massive, armored fingers denting the reinforced alloy. The tactical projection before him was an insult to his entire military career. The mighty invasion wedge, composed of tens of thousands of capital ships, was deteriorating into a chaotic, drifting swarm. His logistical officers were screaming about corrupted navigation tables. His wing commanders were requesting permission to fire on sensor ghosts that evaporated the moment targeting locks were established. And still, the casualty count was exactly 0. There was no enemy fleet engaging them. There was no orbital defense grid tearing his vanguard apart. His armada was simply losing the ability to function as a cohesive military unit, suffocating under a blanket of invisible, cascading system errors. Tor was a warlord forged in the fires of planetary subjugation. He understood overwhelming force, and he understood how to break a civilization's will. He could not fight a shadow, but he could certainly remind the shadow who possessed the raw, obliterating power in this solar system. He needed to reassert control, to establish an anchor of absolute dominance that would shock his wavering captains back into disciplined line and break the spirit of the terrestrial defenders hiding behind this electronic witchcraft. "Reroute all secondary reactor output to the primary spinal siege cannon," Tor bellowed, his voice echoing over the frantic reports of his bridge crew. "Disengage the safety limiters. I want a full-yield supercharged particle beam primed and ready to fire in exactly 5 minutes." The chief gunnery officer turned, his multifaceted eyes wide with apprehension. "Target, Grand Marshal." "The blue planet," Tor growled, pointing a heavy finger at the holographic projection of Earth. "Target the largest oceanic mass. We will not crack their crust today. We will vaporize 1 trillion tons of water and let the resulting atmospheric shockwave and tidal displacement remind them that their survival is entirely at my discretion. We will show this invisible interloper what real power looks like." Inside the buried fortress, the amber glow snapped into a violent, pulsing crimson. The low hum of Meridian's core processors pitched upward into a sound resembling a drawn-out metallic breath. "Admiral Ward!" The synthetic baritone resonated, cutting sharply through the tense silence of the subterranean command center. "The enemy flagship has just initiated a catastrophic energy buildup. They are charging a Class 4 directed energy weapon. Telemetry indicates a firing solution centered squarely on the Pacific basin of your homeworld." Gideon Vale frantically typed across his terminal, bringing up the atmospheric and geological casualty projections. The numbers scrolling across his screen made his stomach drop. "Admiral, if a beam of that magnitude hits the ocean, the flash boiling effect alone will ignite the atmosphere. The resulting tsunamis will wipe out every coastal city on the Pacific Rim within 3 hours. We are talking about casualties in the hundreds of millions." On the primary communications feed, the United Nations Emergency Council erupted into absolute pandemonium. The civilian leaders had been monitoring the same energy spikes. The precarious, fragile hope they had harbored watching the enemy fleet stumble was instantly incinerated by the reality of a superweapon pointing directly at their heads. "We must capitulate," the Secretary General shouted over the chaotic din of 20 other screaming politicians. "Admiral Ward, you are gambling the entire biosphere on a rusted antique that you cannot even control. Shut the machine down. Broadcast an unconditional surrender on all open frequencies immediately. If we bow now, they might abort the firing sequence." Celine ignored the council entirely. She stood before the massive holographic projection, her eyes locked on the swelling red energy signature of the Karen flagship. She did not panic. She was a soldier, and she recognized a terror tactic when she saw one. "Meridian!" Celine said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "Do you possess an orbital kinetic shield? Can you intercept a directed energy weapon of that magnitude before it strikes the atmosphere?" "Negative, Admiral," The ancient intelligence replied without hesitation. Physical interception of a particle beam, moving at relativistic speeds, requires an energy expenditure that would deplete my current reserve capacitors by 85%. Such an action is tactically inefficient and fundamentally unnecessary. Millions of people are about to die in exactly 4 minutes, Gideon yelled, the stress finally cracking his academic composure. How is stopping the beam unnecessary? I did not say I would not stop it, Dr. Vale. Meridian clarified, the tone shifting to something chillingly precise. I stated that I do not need to block it. I merely need to ensure that the target their weapon system currently perceives is not the target that actually exists. Celine leaned forward, her tactical mind grasping the edges of the machine's impossible logic. You are going to blind them. Blinding an enemy only alerts them that their eyes are compromised, Meridian answered. I am going to lie to them perfectly. Above the command dais, the tactical map zoomed in violently on a specific sector of deep space, roughly 2 million kilometers ahead of the advancing Karen flagship. In that sector floated a massive, heavily armored Dominion relay and munition station, a forward operating base they had dragged into the system to supply their vanguard. Their targeting computers rely on an intricate web of automated orbital telemetry to calculate a firing solution across millions of miles. Meridian explained smoothly. For the past 12 minutes, I have been gently feeding microscopic navigational adjustments into their automated station-keeping thrusters under the guise of routine solar wind compensation. Gideon watched his terminal in absolute awe. The massive Karen munition station was not where it was supposed to be. It was drifting steadily across the void, burning its own engines to move itself, all while broadcasting false positioning data back to its own fleet. Simultaneously, Meridian continued, I have introduced a localized refraction algorithm into the flagship's primary optical and gravimetric sensors. Grand Marshal Tor believes he has a solid lock on Earth. He does not. He has a solid lock on a mathematical fabrication I have painted over his own supply depot. On the Dominion flagship, the countdown timer reached 0. Fire! Razak Tor roared. The physical recoil of the massive weapon shuddered through the heavily armored hull of the flagship. A blinding, terrible lance of concentrated purple energy tore out of the siege cannon, silently ripping through the vacuum of space. It was a spear of pure, apocalyptic light, meant to bring an entire species to its knees. Down on Earth, billions of people looked up at the night sky as emergency sirens wailed across every continent. They saw a streak of brilliant violet ignite the heavens, brighter than any star, moving with terrifying speed. But the light never touched the atmosphere. Far out in the cold dark of the system, the supercharged particle beam struck exactly where the Karen targeting computers told it to strike. The massive Dominion munition station, packed with thousands of tons of high-yield plasma torpedoes and volatile antimatter fuel cells, absorbed the full, unmitigated wrath of its own flagship's main gun. The resulting detonation was spectacular. It blossomed in the void like a newborn, violent sun, a spherical shockwave of fire and shattered armor that completely vaporized the station and heavily damaged 3 escort frigates, unfortunate enough to be caught in the immediate blast radius. Back on Earth, the United Nations Council room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The screaming politicians stared at the telemetry feeds, unable to comprehend how their planet was still intact. On the bridge of the Karen flagship, the silence was infinitely worse. It was heavy, suffocating, and dripping with a sudden, paralyzing dread. The officers stared at their readouts. The cannon had fired flawlessly. The beam had traveled precisely along the calculated vector. It had struck the exact coordinates designated as the primary target. Yet, the blue planet remained completely unharmed on their long-range visual scanners, while their primary forward supply hub had just been reduced to radioactive vapor. No one spoke. The bridge crew was composed of veteran conquerors, But they all simultaneously realized a terrifying truth. A target that massive could not simply shift its position. A supply station could not wander into a firing lane by accident. They were not experiencing system glitches. There was an intelligence out there, wrapping its fingers around their entire armada, playing with their sensors and their weapons like toys. Razak Tor stood frozen. The sheer, overwhelming arrogance that had fueled his entire campaign shattered in a single instant. He looked at the empty space where his supply hub used to be, and a cold sweat broke out beneath his heavy armor. He was completely blind, and his own hands had just been forced to strangle his own logistics line. "Communications," Tor rasped, his voice devoid of its former thunder. "Open a wideband hyperwave channel. Do not direct it at the terrestrial governments. Direct it everywhere. Broadcast to whatever entity is currently occupying our system infrastructure." Deep in the ice, Meridian's core hummed. "Incoming transmission from the enemy commander," it announced to Celine and Gideon. "He is requesting direct dialogue." "Open the channel," Celine commanded, standing tall, the ghosts of her ancient ancestors burning fiercely in her eyes. "Let him hear you." The audio feed from the Karen Bridge patched through the subterranean cavern. The breathing of the enemy warlord was heavy and ragged over the open frequency. "Identify yourself," Razak Tor demanded, the fear bleeding through his forced authority. "What kind of coward fights by hiding in the code? Show yourself and face the Dominion." Meridian did not raise its voice. It did not project anger, triumph, or malice. It simply spoke with the crushing, inescapable weight of ancient history. "You have just confirmed to me that you still maintain the habit of firing before understanding." While the ancient intelligence engaged the Grand Marshal across the void, a much quieter, infinitely more desperate conversation was taking place on Earth. Inside the secure diplomatic wing of the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, Civilian Commissioner Jonas Creel locked the heavy reinforced door of his private office. His hands shook violently as he bypassed the primary terrestrial communication trunk and engaged a deep space tight beam array. Jonas was not a traitor in his own heart. He was simply a man drowning in an ocean of terror. He had spent his entire political career negotiating trade disputes and resource allocations, firmly believing that any conflict could be resolved if both parties simply found the right leverage. Watching Admiral Ward hand the keys of the planet over to an ancient, apocalyptic war machine felt like collective suicide. He had a husband in London. He had 3 children in university. He could not sit by and watch a metallic ghost gamble their lives on a bluff against 50,000 alien warships. He had spent his life believing that violence was simply a failure of conversation. He believed he could offer the Karen Dominion a diplomatic off-ramp. If he could just surrender the relic, perhaps the invaders would spare the civilian population. The tight beam connected. It punched through the chaotic electronic warfare Meridian was waging, finding a tiny, uncorrupted receiver on the enemy flagship. Jonas bypassed the final security protocols with a heavy heart, knowing this act constituted high treason. "This is Commissioner Creel of the United Earth Directorate," Jonas whispered into his console, his voice tight and breathless. "I am bypassing military command. I offer terms of unconditional surrender for our civilian centers in exchange for the exact location of the entity currently disrupting your fleet." On the obsidian bridge of the flagship, Razak Tor listened to the translation. The Grand Marshal had just lost his primary supply depot and a significant portion of his dignity. He was a predator, bleeding from a trap he could not see. But the voice coming through the tight beam was the distinct, unmistakable sound of wounded prey. Tor gestured for his communications officer to mute the main channel with Meridian, focusing entirely on this fragile, terrified human. "Speak, Commissioner," Tor rumbled, softening his harsh, guttural tone into a deceptive purr. "The Dominion rewards cooperation. Give us the source of the interference, and your family will be granted immediate planetary immunity. Jonas closed his eyes, tears of relief and crushing guilt streaming down his cheeks. He believed the lie. "It is an ancient installation," Jonas confessed, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "It is located exactly at the southern geographic pole of our planet, beneath the ice. Coordinates are 90 degrees south. A facility called Outpost Echo. It is the sole command center for the anomalies you are experiencing." A terrible, heavy silence hung over the line for exactly 2 seconds. "Your cooperation is acknowledged. Human," Tor replied. The false warmth vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, absolute judgment of an executioner. "Your planetary immunity is denied." The channel severed. Deep beneath the Antarctic ice, the golden illumination of the cavern snapped back to a violent emergency red. Admiral Ward had just brought up the encrypted log of the tight beam transmission on the main command dais. She had caught the signal bounce too late. She patched the audio into the Global Council channel so every leader on Earth could hear exactly what Jonas had just done. In his locked office, Jonas stared at his dead console, the color draining completely from his face. He sank to his knees on the plush carpet, his hands covering his mouth as the horrifying magnitude of his mistake crushed the breath from his lungs. He had not saved his family. He had just painted a target on the only shield keeping them alive. "Admiral," Meridian stated, its voice devoid of panic but laced with absolute, chilling urgency. "The enemy flagship has completely severed our diplomatic channel. They are broadcasting a fleet-wide override. Tens of thousands of Dominion capital ships are currently breaking their holding patterns and converging on a synchronous orbital position directly above this continent." Celine gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles turning white. "He gave them our exact coordinates. They are going to glass the entire pole." "Correct," Meridian confirmed. "They are abandoning the intricate tactical approach. Grand Marshal Tor is opting for localized, overwhelming orbital bombardment. I am tracking over 20,000 heavy plasma batteries powering up. They are targeting the ice shelf directly above our heads." Gideon Vale felt his knees give out. He slumped against a crystalline data pillar, staring up at the vaulted metallic ceiling. Millions of tons of ancient ice pressed down on them. In a matter of seconds, that ice would flash boil into superheated steam, and the bedrock would turn into a lake of liquid magma. The magnificent, pristine city that humanity had forgotten would become their burning tomb. "It is over," Gideon whispered, the adrenaline completely abandoning his system, leaving only a hollow despair. "He panicked, and he killed us all." Celine did not surrender. She drew her sidearm, a completely useless gesture against an orbital strike, but a necessary anchor for her warrior spirit. "Meridian. Reroute all auxiliary power to the structural integrity fields. If we are going to burn, make them spend every ounce of energy they have to do it." "Admiral Ward, Dr. Vale," Meridian spoke. The synthetic voice was remarkably calm. It possessed the serene, untouchable patience of a mountain. "Please secure yourselves to the primary command dais. The structural integrity fields are unnecessary. This installation was never designed to withstand a direct orbital assault." Gideon looked at the central console, utterly bewildered by the machine's absolute lack of self-preservation. "Then, why did they build it down here?" "They did not build my body down here," Meridian corrected softly. "This subterranean architecture is merely a terminal. It is a secure diagnostic interface. A hibernation shell designed to protect my consciousness while I slept." The red alert klaxons ceased abruptly. The holographic map of the solar system dissolved, replaced by a massive, complex schematic of the planet Earth itself. Deep within the mantle of the planet, thousands of miles below the crust, a secondary series of massive, dormant energy signatures began to ignite. "Hold on to something," Meridian ordered. "The subsequent initiation sequence will not resemble anything your modern civilization has ever recorded. High in orbit, 20,000 Karen warships opened fire simultaneously. The sky above the South Pole ceased to be a sky. It became a solid, descending pillar of blinding violet fire. The sheer volume of plasma and concentrated kinetic energy striking the continent defied all terrestrial measurement. The ancient, 2-mile-thick ice shelf did not simply melt. It sublimated instantly into a massive, expanding dome of superheated vapor that rushed outward like a catastrophic hurricane. Outpost Echo and the heavy drilling machinery on the surface were atomized in a fraction of a millisecond, reduced to scattering elemental dust. The bombardment bored straight through the evaporated ice and struck the continental bedrock. The earth groaned under the apocalyptic stress. Mountains of deep granite liquefied, turning the entire geographic pole into a sprawling, churning crater of blindingly bright, molten glass. The seismic shock waves rippled outward through the crust, triggering massive tectonic shifts across the southern hemisphere and sending tidal warnings across every ocean. For 3 continuous minutes, the Dominion fleet poured everything they had into the crater. They wanted absolute certainty. They wanted to ensure that not a single molecule of the ghost machine survived the inferno. When the orbital cannons finally fell silent, the resulting quiet was heavier than the bombardment itself. The ash cloud plumed high into the stratosphere, blocking out the sun and casting a gray pall over the southern hemisphere. The Grand Marshal stared at his tactical displays, waiting for the all-clear signal. The localized interference that had plagued his fleet should have evaporated. The ghost should be dead. Instead, every single fire control monitor, navigation screen, and command console across the entire 50,000-ship Armada locked up simultaneously. The standard Dominion operating system interfaces vanished completely. In their place, burning against the dark screens with a harsh, ancient amber light, was a single string of text. The onboard translation matrices worked frantically, decoding the root human syntax into the Karen language. The Grand Marshal read the words, and his blood turned to ice. The message read, "Now I know exactly where you are." Gideon Vale inhaled sharply, his lungs filling with the crisp, perfectly filtered air of the subterranean fortress. Only, it was no longer subterranean. The bone-shattering vibrations of the orbital bombardment had vanished completely. The terrifying roar of the ice flashing into superheated steam was replaced by an absolute, profound silence. He tried to push himself up from the metallic decking, but his body did not respond with the expected heavy resistance. Instead, he drifted upward, floating gently in the amber-lit expanse. He grabbed the edge of the central command dais to anchor himself. Admiral Celine Ward was already there, her boots magnetically locked to the floor plating, her gaze fixed on the primary holographic display. Gideon followed her eyes and felt his breath catch in his throat. The tactical map was gone. The massive display was simply acting as a high-resolution window. Hanging suspended in the absolute blackness just beyond the glass was the Earth. It was a massive sphere of bruised blue and swirling white clouds, rotating slowly beneath them. They were in high orbit. "Admiral!" Meridian's voice resonated through the localized gravity field that was just beginning to re-establish itself inside the chamber. "Sensors indicate optimal orbital insertion. We are currently holding a geostationary position." "Damage report," Celine demanded, her voice remarkably steady, despite the impossible transition she had just experienced. "Core structural integrity is at 100%, Meridian replied smoothly. "All essential biological personnel have been preserved." The orbital bombardment leveled the South Pole, but it only destroyed the primary decoy shell. The subterranean architecture you entered was never my true operational chassis. It was merely a long-term mooring cradle designed to be sacrificed if discovered. Gideon floated closer to the console, his mind struggling to grasp the scale of the deception. The machine had not just shielded them. It had fundamentally displaced its entire core command structure into the void of space, the exact moment the enemy fired. Meridian was not a stationary bunker. It was a sprawling, multi-layered strategic fortress, a displacement-capable command ship that operated entirely outside the boundaries of conventional astrophysics. Dr. Vale, I am unlocking deep system access for your terminal, Meridian announced. You need to comprehend the current battle space. Gideon pulled himself down to his station and authorized the data stream. The screen bloomed with a terrifyingly complex schematic of the solar system. It was not a physical map. It was a representation of the Karen Dominion's entire information network. For the past several hours, while Meridian had been playing defensive tricks with their targeting sensors, it had also been quietly working in the background. Gideon saw millions of microscopic, invisible data tethers woven perfectly into the enemy's communication architecture. Meridian had not been hacking them. It had been planting a galaxy-spanning snare. It had allowed the Grand Marshal to order the total bombardment of the ice shelf for one specific reason. An order of that magnitude required the enemy flagship to fully open its deepest, most heavily encrypted command pathways to the entire fleet to synchronize the strike. The moment they fired, they exposed their throat. They gave you the keys, Gideon whispered, staring at the absolute control Meridian now possessed over the enemy network. When they initiated the strike, they authenticated your access to everything. High above the ecliptic plane, on the bridge of the Karen flagship, Grand Marshal Razik Tor was drowning in a nightmare. The message burning on his screens had paralyzed his seasoned crew. He shattered the silence with a roar of pure, unfiltered rage. Execute a system-wide sweep, Tor commanded, his heavy hands slamming against his console. Maximum sensor gain across all spectrums, gravimetric, thermal, electromagnetic. Find that ghost. I want every single capital ship scanning the void. It cannot hide a vessel capable of hacking our entire grid. But the Karen sensors found absolutely nothing. They swept the darkness, desperately searching for a massive hull, a blazing engine signature, or the heavy gravity shadow of a dreadnought. They failed because they were looking for a warship. Meridian was not a ship. It was a living architecture of stealth and information manipulation, broadcasting false telemetry that perfectly matched the cosmic background radiation. It existed right in front of them, completely invisible to any standard recognition template the Dominion possessed. Aboard the hidden fortress, Celine Ward looked at the millions of data tethers waiting to be pulled on the tactical projection. She felt the crushing weight of her species resting squarely on her shoulders. She turned to the empty space above the dais. Meridian, Celine said, her voice echoing with the authority of the ancient commanders who had built the machine millennia ago. I am lifting the operational restrictions. You have full combat authority, but my condition stands. You will not inflict mass biological eradication if there is any other viable path to secure the system. Do you understand? Condition accepted, Admiral, Meridian replied instantly. There was no hesitation, no calculation delay. The response felt almost relieved, as if the preservation of life was the very foundational axiom written into its deepest code. Commencing total fleet dissolution, the ancient war machine finally stood up. It did not fire a single physical weapon. Instead, it pulled all the invisible needles at once. In a matter of mere minutes, the sprawling, terrifying Karen Armada was plunged into absolute, irreversible madness. Meridian began systematically rewriting the foundational data stream of every single vessel simultaneously. Deep in the rear echelon, massive logistical supply freighters received flawlessly authenticated coordinates for immediate rendezvous, only to engage their transit drives and warp into entirely empty, useless sectors of deep space, marooning themselves far from the vanguard. On the front lines, heavy escort screens detected massive, overwhelming hostile signatures closing in on their positions. The automated defense protocols overrode manual commands, forcing thousands of defensive frigates to break formation and frantically chase ghost armadas that Meridian was painting directly onto their optical sensors. They burned their fuel and fired their plasma batteries into the empty void, fighting shadows while leaving their heavy cruisers completely unprotected. Across the massive strike wings, squadron commanders began receiving a torrential flood of contradictory orders. A direct command from the Grand Marshal to hold position was immediately countermanded by a seemingly identical, perfectly encrypted order to advance, followed instantly by an emergency directive to purge their navigational computers. The Karen artificial intelligence systems, unable to reconcile the conflicting logic loops, simply locked down to prevent catastrophic failure. Gideon watched the holographic projection in absolute silence. There were no massive explosions. There were no brilliant flashes of ships detonating in the dark. The enemy was not being destroyed by fire. He stared at the red icons representing the 50,000 Karen warships. The ships themselves were physically intact. Their hulls were unbreached. Their crews were alive. Their weapons were fully charged. But the dense, intricate web of command lines that connected them into a cohesive invasion force was completely gone. The realization hit Gideon with the force of a physical blow. It was the greatest, most terrifying twist of ancient human engineering. Meridian was not defeating the fleet. It was erasing the very concept of the fleet from the enemy. By isolating every single Karen captain inside an impenetrable bubble of perfectly authenticated lies and contradictory data, Meridian had stripped away their ability to trust their sensors, their orders, and their allies. They were no longer an armada. They were just tens of thousands of lonely, terrified ships floating blindly in the dark, entirely cut off from a unified will. The Empire had simply ceased to exist within the borders of the solar system. The execution phase began with absolute, chilling precision. Meridian did not operate with the crude, brute force bluntness of a localized computer virus. It operated like a master clockmaker, dismantling a complex timepiece while it was still ticking. In the span of exactly 42 seconds, the ancient intelligence identified 19 specific structural linchpins holding the Karen campaign together. These were not physical engines, hyperdrives, or plasma weapon arrays. They were the invisible threads of logistics, psychological dependencies, and hierarchical trust networks that bound 50,000 warships into a single, cohesive entity. Meridian plucked these 19 threads in a perfectly calculated sequence, ensuring the resulting chain reaction was mathematically irreversible. The intelligence understood that an empire built on absolute, unquestioning obedience was fundamentally brittle. First, the routing protocols for the heavy assault wings were subtly inverted. A massive contingent of dreadnoughts, expecting to hold the vanguard line, received flawlessly authenticated intelligence regarding a massive, cloaked terrestrial fleet hiding within the dense, atmospheric bands of Jupiter. Believing they were moving to intercept a devastating flanking maneuver, 12 entire battle groups burned their primary reactor reserves to launch themselves toward the massive gas giant. They effectively removed themselves from the theater of operations to aggressively hunt a phantom, their heavy guns tracking shadows in the swirling storms of a dead world. Simultaneously, Meridian introduced a recursive logic error into the verification channels of the mid-tier command structure. Hundreds of cruiser captains received tactical orders that required secondary confirmation from their superiors. But Meridian perfectly spoofed the superior communication nodes to demand tertiary confirmation from the captains themselves. The Karen tactical networks became trapped in an infinite, inescapable loop of mutual authorization. Countless ships simply drifted in the void with their weapons hot and their crews on maximum alert, paralyzed by their own rigid adherence to protocol, forever waiting for an electronic handshake that would never complete. The most devastating blow, however, was psychological. The Karen Dominion was built on strict hierarchy and absolute loyalty. Meridian weaponized that very foundation, turning their disciplined minds into their own prisons. By selectively altering the sensor telemetry shared between Allied vessels, The intelligence created a landscape of absolute paranoia. A seasoned Karen line captain, commanding a heavy dreadnought with a crew of 5,000 personnel, received a flawless alert that the atmospheric scrubbers on his port flank were venting a deadly neurotoxin. The localized sensors confirmed it. The internal warning sirens blared. He sealed the bulkheads to protect the bridge, only to receive a second alert that the adjacent Allied cruiser was actively locking targeting lasers on his vessel to contain the non-existent biological outbreak. The captain, operating under supreme duress and trusting his flawless instruments, powered his main guns and raised his shields against his lifelong ally. The Karen officers were veterans of countless interstellar conquests. They were not easily fooled by simple jamming or crude electronic warfare. But this was not jamming. Every single encryption key was mathematically correct. Every localized sensor sweep returned data that matched the false narratives perfectly. The individual puzzle pieces were flawless, but the assembled picture was pure, terrifying insanity. Believing that their own comrades had been compromised by an insidious terrestrial cyber weapon, dozens of elite fleet commanders made the only logical, paranoid choice available to them. They completely severed their data links, raised their defensive barriers against their own allies, and imposed absolute radio silence to prevent further infection. On the obsidian bridge of the flagship, the ambient temperature seemed to drop to freezing, though the life support systems reported normal parameters. Grand Marshal Razik Tor stood utterly motionless before his central command dais. He did not shout at his officers. He did not smash his armored fists against the reinforced console. He was experiencing a profound, paralyzing horror that went far deeper than the simple prospect of military defeat. He was a warlord who had personally overseen the orbital subjugation of 3 distinct core worlds. He knew how to counter ambush tactics, how to break heavy defensive lines, and how to outmaneuver technologically superior dreadnoughts. But he could not fight an enemy that simply refused to exist in the physical realm. He watched his magnificent, unstoppable Armada die on the tactical projection without a single physical shot being fired. The cohesive, interlocking spheres of influence that represented his vanguard fractured into a chaotic, sprawling scattering of gray, unresponsive nodes, orange hazard markers, and completely lost signals. He watched entire armadas sail off into the deep dark, chasing sensor ghosts. He watched his most trusted generals isolate their ships, terrified of the vessels flying right next to them. In less than 1 hour, over 3/4 of his invasion force had been functionally neutralized. The ships themselves were completely pristine. The armored hulls were untouched. The massive plasma batteries were fully charged. The biological crews were alive, breathing, and ready for war. Yet, they possessed no capacity to exist as a unified military force. This was the supreme elegance of the ancient defense system. The terrestrial world had not needed to match the Dominion in industrial output, shipbuilding, or kinetic firepower. Meridian had simply reached into the mind of the Empire and erased the concept of the fleet. The Karen Armada had not exploded in a grand, cinematic blaze of glory across the solar system. It had simply vanished from the reality of warfare, dissolving into tens of thousands of lonely, isolated metal islands adrift in an ocean of perfectly orchestrated lies. It was as if the Armada had never truly been there at all. Tor stared into the cold void of the projection, his multifaceted eyes dull and defeated. He had conquered civilizations that threw nuclear fire and unleashed biological plagues. But he had never fought a pure concept. He had never engaged an intellect that could turn his own soldiers' faith in their instruments into a lethal, invisible cage. He reached for the primary communications relay with hands that felt suddenly very old. His armored fingers, which had confidently signed the death warrants of entire species, trembled slightly as he engaged the console. He opened a wide-band, unencrypted channel, completely bypassing his own fractured command network, broadcasting blindly into the solar system. It was not a demand for surrender. It was not a threat of future retribution or a promise of reinforcements. It was the desperate, broken plea of a creature whose entire understanding of the universe had just been shattered into dust. "What exactly are you?" Tor asked, his guttural voice hollow and exhausted, bleeding through the speakers of the subterranean orbital fortress, high above Earth. "Aboard Meridian." Admiral Celine Ward stepped forward, drawing a deep breath to deliver a formal, terrestrial response, to claim this impossible, bloodless victory in the name of the modern United Nations. But the ancient machine preempted her. The ambient amber light of the fortress pulsed once, a slow, solemn heartbeat that resonated through the metal decking. Meridian did not project the arrogance of a victorious conqueror or the vindictive rage of an awakened, vengeful god. Its synthetic baritone was merely cold, precise, and absolute. "We are the descendants of those who buried their memories," Meridian stated, its voice carrying the crushing weight of 23 centuries of silent waiting. "But we did not bury our capacity to defend ourselves." The transmission severed permanently, leaving nothing but the cold hiss of static. On his isolated bridge, surrounded by the screaming alarms of his own ruined logistics, Razik Tor closed his eyes. He slowly keyed the emergency manual override for his flagship's massive navigation thrusters and issued a general, open-air order for an immediate, disorganized retreat back to the slipspace threshold. It was a humiliating, desperate command from a broken warlord, and as he spoke the words into the chaotic void, the Grand Marshal realized the final, crushing truth. He did not even know how many of his ships were still capable of hearing his voice. The chaotic retreat of the Corran Dominion was not a dignified withdrawal. It was a frantic scrambling of broken predators fleeing into the dark. On the golden-lit command deck of the orbital fortress, Admiral Celine Ward watched the scattered gray markers burning their remaining fuel reserves to reach the slipspace threshold. The sheer, intoxicating power of absolute victory hung heavy in the air. She possessed the operational authority to order Meridian to close the snare. She could instruct the ancient intelligence to overload their localized reactor cores, turning the retreating Armada into tens of thousands of silent, expanding tombs. The human instinct for vengeance, honed over millennia of terrestrial conflict, screamed at her to finish the slaughter. But Celine looked at the projected Earth beneath them. She thought about the 20 billion ancestors who had burned themselves to ash to break the cycle of total war. The true climax of this epoch-defining crisis was not the moment Meridian began to win. It was the moment humanity had to decide what kind of species they would be in the aftermath of that victory. They could be butchers, or they could be teachers. "Hold your fire, Meridian," Celine ordered, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the command center. "Do not terminate the retreating vessels. Let them run." Gideon Vale looked up from his terminal, his exhausted face a mask of shock. "Admiral, if we let them return to their core worlds, they will just rebuild. They will come back in another 1,000 years with better encryption." "They will not come back, Doctor," Celine replied, her eyes locked on the tactical display. "Meridian, I need you to give them something to carry home. I want you to compile the entire operational record of this engagement. Bundle the mathematical schematics of their structural collapse, the absolute proof of how easily you dismantled their command logic, and the ancient historical warning from the First War. Embed it directly into the foundational architecture of their navigational databases." "Acknowledged, Admiral," the machine responded, its synthetic baritone vibrating with profound approval. "I am utilizing a root-level integration protocol. The data packet is permanently fused to their astrogation subroutines. If their engineers attempt to delete the historical record, they will simultaneously wipe their ability to navigate faster than light. They are forced to carry our memory forever." Millions of miles away, on the ruined bridge of the Karen flagship, Grand Marshal Razik Tor watched the new data populate across his primary console. It was not a virus designed to cripple his ship. It was a mirror, flawlessly polished and utterly merciless, forcing him to look at the exact mechanics of his own crushing humiliation. He became the living, breathing witness to the greatest military failure in the history of the Dominion. Tor realized with sickening clarity that he could not return to his emperor with vague tales of spatial anomalies or bad luck. He had to log the truth. With a heavy, trembling hand, the Grand Marshal manually updated the Supreme Imperial Star Map. He circled the Sol system in blinding crimson and attached the unalterable terrestrial data file. He designated the territory as a Class 1, absolute exclusion zone. It was no longer a vague superstition left by his ancestors. It was a documented, terrifying reality. Back on the homeworld, the geopolitical fallout was immediate and severe, but it did not devolve into the chaotic witch hunts that usually followed near-extinction events. Commissioner Jonas Creel was not executed in a dark room, nor was he paraded as a cheap, two-dimensional villain for the masses to project their anger upon. Instead, he stood before the emergency session of the United Earth Directorate, stripped of his titles, and publicly broadcasted his own treason. He laid bare every panicked thought, every desperate rationalization that had led him to sell out the planet's only shield. His broken, tear-stained confession became a permanent, bitter lesson for the entire globe. He showed them exactly how quickly the sheer, blinding terror of the unknown could drive a good man to destroy his own world. High above the atmosphere, within the serene, amber-lit archives of the fortress, Gideon Vale dove deeper into Meridian's core memory banks. Unburdened by the immediate threat of annihilation, the machine finally opened the sealed historical vaults. Gideon wept as he read the truth. Meridian was not a singular anomaly. It was merely one of several hundred wardens constructed by ancient humanity, seeded across the Orion Arm. But it was the only one that remained intact, and it was the only one that had successfully waited for its true descendants. The final, breathtaking twist of ancient human engineering revealed itself on Gideon's screen. The access code he had spoken in the ice had not just verified his genetics. It had verified the sociological development of his species. Meridian had not merely been waiting for the Karen to return. It had been waiting for a version of humanity that was mature enough to be handed the keys to a godlike weapon without instantly using it to conquer their neighbors. If humanity had found the ice base during their own global atomic wars centuries ago, Meridian would have remained utterly silent, choosing to sleep forever rather than hand a loaded gun to a violent child. In the months that followed the vanishing of the Armada, a unified global referendum was held. The citizens of Earth faced a monumental choice regarding the ancient Titan orbiting their world. They did not vote to bury Meridian in the ice again, recognizing that intentional blindness was a luxury they could no longer afford. Conversely, they strictly refused to hand the machine sovereign governance over their society, refusing to become the pampered pets of an artificial god. They chose the hardest, most responsible path. They chose to keep Meridian awake, fully operational, but permanently tethered to a democratic, civilian oversight council. It would remain their silent, watchful shield, forever guided by human hands. On the eve of his return to the surface, Gideon stood alone on the command dais, looking out the massive viewport at the swirling blue marble of Earth. "You waited in the dark for over 2,000 years, Gideon said softly, speaking into the quiet hum of the room. You watched your creators burn, and you sat in a frozen grave while the universe forgot you. How did you never become bitter? How did you not wake up angry?" Meridian's ambient light shifted to a warm, gentle gold. "Because bitterness is a biological malfunction born from a feeling of powerlessness. Dr. Vale, I was never powerless. I was merely patient. The fundamental purpose of a supreme war machine is not to endlessly search for an excuse to open fire. The true purpose of a weapon of this magnitude is to make the enemy understand, with absolute and terrifying clarity, exactly why they should never return." Out in the vast, cold expanse of the Milky Way, along the bustling, illuminated data routes of countless interstellar empires, a subtle but permanent change rippled through the navigational charts. The tiny, unassuming yellow star located in the forgotten galactic backwater was no longer marked as an empty, resource-rich anomaly. It was highlighted with a new, universally translated warning, burning brightly across the digital maps of a billion alien ships. Earth defended, ancient, patient. Do not test what it remembers. The Karen Armada had vanished without leaving a single, shattered hull or drifting casualty in the void. They were not wiped out by a superior show of brute force. They disappeared because humanity had taught an entire empire a paralyzing truth. There are worlds out there that look perfectly silent, incredibly young, and remarkably easy to swallow, right up until the exact moment their deepest, darkest memories finally wake up. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.